Well, hello everybody and welcome to my show. My name is Jason DaCosta and this is Consistent Preterism. Thank you for joining me today. Today I'm going to be doing a little bit of a response to a video that was put out by Derek over on Mythvision podcast, and the video was titled, "Is Israel Only Strawmanning Dr. Jason Staples?" Now, it seems as though the title would be better suited as "Is Jason DaCosta Strawmanning Dr. Jason Staples?" But he decided to put Israel Only there and then just refer to my driving video and response, or not even response, but my driving discussion that I did on Dr. Jason Staples' 2011 article. And so Derek put this out, I don't know, maybe, let's see, what's the date on it? Like at least 3 or 4 days ago, maybe 5. And I eventually got around to listening to about the first half of it, and there were some things in there that were pretty cringeworthy. So and no offense to Derek. Derek knows I love him. He's a good kid. I got nothing against him. I just have to call it how it is. So there were some things in this video that needed to be addressed. And, a lot of times with these videos that people do, whether it's against IO, discussing IO, whatever the case may be, these are good opportunities for me to engage certain points, different thoughts, without going the whole formal, route. In other words, without planning something, without having to slot out time, without having to do this, that, and the other. It's just easier for me to take a look at some of these statements and articles and videos and just kind of rant about the things that are said and do it at my pace. And so that's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to kind of play this out. We'll see how far into it we can get. Hopefully we'll do it all. If not, we'll probably do most of it. But I just wanted to address some of the things that were said, try to clear up some things, and also share a couple other things with you as well. So again, this video is from Derek's channel. It's called "Is Israel Only Strawmanning Dr. Jason Staples?" And let's just kind of start playing the video, and we will just jump right in with it. Here we go.
If you want to help Mythvision podcast grow, you can join our Patreon. There are different tiers, as well as help out with PayPal. Thank you so much. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and comment. Ladies and gentlemen, we are Mythvision. I just wanted to show you guys something glorious before I get into this. That right there is the queen of my life. Sorry the room's a mess, but we're over here. Just moved into our new house, and I'm about to try to chip away at something the best I can. I had to write this up. We had to have this documented, if you will, because it's just too much to go over. So, it's the Messianic New Covenant Israelitism. On August the 14th, my friend Jason DaCosta put a video discussing the views of Dr. Jason Staples from the perspective of Israel only. And today he put out yet another video discussing Dr. Staples. And I have to say, as much as I was really looking forward to hearing Jason's take, because he has some really good videos, I think there's some major issues with his analysis. So I'd like to take the time to set the record straight for Jason and others. And before I even start, I want you to know, I honestly think that if me and him hung out in person and I was still drinking, I said this the other day, we would have beers together and hang out, probably have, cookout, family hangouts, things like that. I think he's a great guy. I think he's a very likable dude. I think he just seems really cool. Really cool.
I'm a pretty cool dude. Derek seems like a cool dude as well. So totally agree with him. There's nothing, there. But just to back up on what he said about, he called this my analysis. Now, I don't know about you folks, but I'm driving a Dodge 1500 pickup truck, cruising through traffic, running over cars in the process. And I'm sort of just discussing certain things, different topics, So there's nothing formal. There's nothing exhaustive about what I do. This is basically just my, Don Preston has his morning musings. This is just my little car ride musings. And I share what's on my brain. I share what I think about certain things. But nothing should be looked at like, oh, this is his formal response to Dr. Jason Staples. If I was going to do a formal response to Dr. Jason Staples, I would start by actually looking at every line of his articles and trying to, explain why that doesn't work within the broader context. But I don't, A, have the time to do that, B, nor do I want to do that. And we'll get into that more later. But just so you know, when we're talking about just a quick 15-minute drive through town and chat about this guy's article, it shouldn't be looked at as that exhaustive, okay?
Old chill guy, and he knows a lot, man. He's a brilliant guy. He knows what he's talking about. So I want to present this. I do like him. He's a very smart, insightful person when it comes to the Bible and Israel only, but I think he's wrong about a few things, and I'd like to point them out.
Derek's like me. He knows how to ease into things. You always got to set the person up with a nice compliment or a few nice compliments, and then you can come in a little harder. But if you come in hard right off the top without complimenting them, like I have a joke about this guy that I work with. He's we call him Pickle Pie Perry, and he's been around for a long time. He's a production manager, and back in the day, in the beginning when he started, because I've been here longer than he has, but when he first started, for the first 5 or 6 years, he was a grumpy mother you-know-what, okay? And you couldn't go to him without him kind of snapping at you, but he was a good worker, so it was one of those double-edged swords. But anyways, I learned very quickly with this guy that in order to sort of get him, I don't want to say bribe him, right? But in order to get him to see things your way and not take it the wrong way, not take it offensively or personally, or not have him think like you're attacking him by asking him to do something extra or whatever. In order to do that, I decided that I was going to compliment him or say something nice and positive to him just prior to when I asked him to do these certain things. And you know what? To this day, it still works. It still works. So there's something to be said about that theory, right? You compliment, you say something positive, you do something nice for somebody before you hit them with, oh, by the way, can you build me this? It has to ship out of here tomorrow. And then he's like, yeah, no problem, man. It's like, but if you go in there, off the top and you're just like, dude, I need this built, you're going to get, oh, man, what the, totally different thing. So I get what Derek's doing. Thanks for the compliments. Now I'm ready to take the shots. Shots fired. Here we go.
For his benefit. Now, of course, before we get on, the scholars and the others, they're going to be bringing in stuff that may not even be discussed in this video.
Now, it's kind of cool, by the way, just to interject here for a second, how his wife is sitting on the bed while he's doing this. I can't even imagine that. That's pretty cool. My wife would look at me like, what the hell are you talking about? But she must be used to it because obviously, looking at Derek here in this video, he's got a cabinet full of stuff on the back of him. He hasn't even got one box unpacked in his house, and he's already making a video here. So I appreciate the hustle.
So we'll be looking forward to Dr. Carrier, Dr. Staples' interview with me, and technically this is just...
I wish I had a doctor in front of my name. Maybe these guys would take me more serious.
Just me putting some notes together and trying to set the record straight. This is not my opinion against his, Jason DaCosta. I'd like to focus strictly on Dr. Staples' work and where I think Jason DaCosta may be misrepresenting it. And I'll try to refer to these gentlemen as Dr. Staples and DaCosta wherever I can, just so I don't confuse their names, same Jason. So I hope this doesn't come off rude in any way. I want to specify that, and I am going to be reading this, so bear with me. I had to type this out. Dr.
Dedication of having to type all this out. Damn.
Staples' article was published 9 years ago in the Journal of Biblical Literature. It's called, What Do the Gentiles Have to Do with All Israel? A fresh look at Romans 11:25 through 27. It's great that IOers like Jason DaCosta are finally getting around to addressing it, but I think they really need to read it carefully before they get too excited about where they think Dr. Staples might agree with their theory. However, DaCosta did...
Now, hold up. Before we go any further, there's a lot of things that have to be cleared up here. First of all, IOers are not excited about this guy backing up or, not backing up their theory. That's really just kind of a silly argument or a silly suggestion on Derek's part, and it comes up a few times in this video. It comes up to the point where it's almost like he thinks that I put out this video about Jason Staples that day that I drove my truck and ran over a couple hundred cars while I was doing so. I put out a video, and Derek thinks that I'm claiming that there's a scholar who backs up I.O. No, not at all. Actually, whether that scholar exists or not is not of concern to me. I couldn't care any less if there's people who confirm or deny I.O. You know how many people deny I.O.? You know how many people object to I.O.? But when you look at their arguments, they're wackadoodle banana sandwich, and they make no sense. So none of that means anything to me. Okay, so yes, I put up a video, a 15-minute video on my YouTube channel. I've put up videos of me Mortal Kombat kicking Big Billy Bell, the Blunder King, years ago. I do crazy stuff on this channel, okay? So it's not, don't look at it like, oh man, he's finally taking on Jason Staples' view. Jason Staples' view is nothing more than another futurist, incorrect theology, is all it is. And if I wanted to really engage and get entangled, Will Smith, entangled, if you're in the meme game, you'll pick up on that. If not, that one went right over the head, ski. But why would I want to entangle with this guy's theology when I could just jump on Facebook, right? Create a Facebook account, jump on Facebook, and get myself entangled with any futurist Christian group out there. There's a million of them. I could take my pick, right? This is nothing different. This is nothing new. I'm not excited about Jason Staples, view because it comes close to I.O. He still thinks he's a wannabe. He still thinks he's an Israelite. He still thinks that he's saved in this salvation mission, which ended at the coming of the Lord, which was the end of the age, which was the destruction of the temple, which was when all Israel was saved, which was when all those who were Christ were raised. That just rolled off the tongue a little too fast. But the point, again, I must stress, is that this isn't exciting for I.O. Okay, it never was. Don't mistake my video about Jason Staples and putting an Israel-only scholar. I mean, if anyone knows about clickbait, it's Derek, right? I mean, this is the guy who's got 20-some-odd thousand followers or subs on YouTube, right? I don't know anything. I just cracked 1,000. I'm just a little fish in the big pond. Derek's kind of like one of those medium-sized fishes, right? And so he's got all this stuff. He knows about clickbait. Why would I put that title on the video, Derek? To get people interested in watching it. That's what you do. You advertise it. Now, is it a bit of false advertising? Sure. But I put a question mark, didn't I? Hold on. Let me make sure I did. Here. This is the nice thing about not doing videos while you're running people over in the Mack truck. You can actually look stuff up. Let's see what we got here. Let me go to the thing. Hold on one second. 10 Northern. All right. So, yeah, I did. I actually put a question mark. Okay? And so, sure, it's a bit of false advertisement, but hey, you do what you can to get people to check stuff out. And that's all there is to it. I don't regret it. I don't take it back. I'm not sorry for it. It is what it is. And everybody does it. Every content creator tries to think of nifty, clever little ways to get people to watch their shite. Okay? So that's what I did. But it's not like I had a you-know-what, because this guy was all, this guy's view comes somewhat close to Israel only. A ton of views come somewhat close to Israel only. Right? There's a ton of views that come somewhat close to Israel only, my particular breed and blend of it with the full preterist paradigm. There's a ton of views that come close, but none of them nail it on the head, right? So there's nothing different about this. Right? I just want to let people know that. Like, Derek's the one that made a fuss over Jason Staples' view, not us. Derek's the one who's been messaging everybody, I got this guy, Jason Staples, who holds kind of this two-house theory about Israel, whatever. But we haven't been the one excited about that, because it doesn't matter. The guy's still a Christian, and we're going to get to that in a second. Here we go.
Admit in his first video on August the 14th that he only read some of Dr. Staples' recent post on Bart Ehrman's blog, and that he should have paid better attention to it. He also committed to reading the blog post in the future and to give a thorough response, which I really hope he does.
Now, yes, I did say that, and I may do that, but one thing I did say right alongside of that is what? I said, if his more recent Ehrman blog posts mimic what he put in the 2011 article that I read, then I'm not going to go and do it again, right? There's no point in doing it again. If it's the same position, that's like Don K. Preston just repeatedly teaching on Matthew 24. I can't do that, right? I have to kind of bounce around a little bit. It's just, if I've looked at his 2011 article and said it's wackadoodle sandwich and it's missing the mark, then that's the end of it, right? Unless he changed and the Bart Ehrman articles are so much different, which I don't believe they are, because even Derek here shortly admits that they're kind of like a recapitulation of his 2011 article.
And he admitted that he really needs to read Staples' 2011 article a second time.
Correct. I did say that because I got so much stuff going on right now. Again, if this was something that I would have been either excited about or a bit concerned with, I probably would have paid much more attention to it. But when I got the gist of what this guy actually believed, along with the fact that he's a Christian and he doesn't understand the end in the story, right away my excitement radar went down, because it's like, okay, he's clearly wrong because he thinks he's part of the story and he misses the end. So that perspective is going to skew everything else. And sure enough, it does, because he has to take this approach of these Gentiles being, mixed, or these Israelites, the northern tribes Israelites being mixed with the nations. He has to take that approach if he can play in the game, because again, that's the way, according to his view, that salvation kind of like opened up to the other nations, is because these Israelites were absorbed, okay? And I did make a slight error in representing his view, and it wasn't intentional. Both ways, no matter which way I would have explained his view, would have been flawed, so it doesn't matter. But I said that he believes that the Israelites were being gathered in alongside of true Gentile pagans, right? The northern tribes were being gathered in alongside of true Gentile pagans. But apparently that's wrong, which is why I want to read it again. Again, I probably wasn't paying too close of attention to it as I should have, but it seems as though, from what Derek has said, is that he believes that it was more of a interracial mixing of the Abraham seed of the Israelites out in the nations that then would save the nations all mixed together. So it was this big mixed bag, right? Even though Paul in places like Romans 9 says, unless you would have left us a seed, we would have become like Sodom and Gomorrah, talking about the children of Israel, who Paul says are the Gentiles whom God is having mercy upon. But there's a ton of places that show that we're not to be so concerned with how these Israelites still remained out in those countries and in those regions. We just have to accept it for what it says, because it's a supernatural tale and it shouldn't be looked at with a fine-tooth comb. But apparently when these guys don't like a theory, they look at supernatural aspects of that theory with a fine-tooth comb. That's just kind of the way that I've noticed a lot of these cats play. Right? If you're going to say it's supernatural, and you're going to say that all the things in it are supernatural, and you're going to laugh and mock and scoff that none of those things actually happened or could have happened in the real realm, then you also must take that same approach to the ingathering of Israel from the nations, right? It's something that couldn't happen here in this real realm. It's supernatural. It probably doesn't make any sense, but it's what the story is saying. Right? Jesus didn't literally float up into the sky, and he's not literally going to come back on a cloud, but that's what the story says, and that's a detail that we need to see. We don't need to judge it or base it upon how believable or how historically accurate or plausible it could be. Okay, so that's just one of the main problems here, but let's continue and see where this goes.
I totally promote that because it's 20 pages and has a lot of information to absorb. I agree that it's definitely worth rereading. Now, after DaCosta's initial reading, right off the bat, he commends Dr. Staples for coming very close to the Israel-only position. He commends Dr. Staples for making the correct distinction between important terms such as Jews being a subset of the Israelites. DaCosta basically takes a victory lap for Israel only.
A victory lap for Israel only? Really? Okay, let's see how he justifies that.
Claiming that Dr. Staples' work 100% backs up his Israel-only view.
Well, it did. It did. And I stand behind that statement. And you know why it did? If you listen to the video, you'd know why it did. Because he used historical facts to prove that the Israelites were out in the nations. He cited Josephus. He cited the Maccabees, I believe. He cited the books in the New Testament that actually refer to the 12 tribes, and not just the 2 southern tribes, but the 12 tribes scattered abroad. He did the work. He cited the examples. I'm not the best with that. Like I said, I'm just a guy who drives around crushing cars in his Dodge Ram pickup truck. I basically should have a mullet and a shotgun in the back seat, for crying out loud. I'm not that guy, okay? I don't go through the exhaustive lengths of finding, the who said this, or the when it was, or the what page, or the what, right? I'm the quick skim surface guy. All right, I got it. Boom, let's roll with it. That's just me. It's always been that way. And I think it's done pretty well. But Derek saying that I claimed victory because of this is kind of ridiculous. I didn't claim anything with it. All I said is that his facts, the facts that Dr. Jason Staples puts in that article, support IO 150%. Now, that doesn't mean exactly, right? That doesn't mean that his view as a whole supports IO, but the work that he did in that article did support IO. Absolutely it did. Go and read it. Go and read it. That's why I recommended any IOer take a good look at it, because a lot of the things that he researched plug right in to the IO viewpoint. Of course, he misses the mark in the big scheme of things, but the facts do back it up. So nothing wrong with what I said there whatsoever.
Now, I put in quotations because a lot of this stuff is actually verbatim in the video response that he did on Dr. Staples, which wasn't a long video. It was a quick video. And so he says it backs up Israel only 100%. He characterizes Dr. Staples as a complete IOer type scholar in terms of his understanding of Romans 11.
Yes, and he, well, I wouldn't say a complete IO type scholar. I guess maybe I probably said that, but what I meant by that is that he's one of the ones who understands Romans 11 at least semi-properly. He understands that Paul is actually referring to the northern tribes, right? When he's, repeating these Old Testament passages. So he does get it a lot more than, say, your Don K. Prestons or your John MacArthur's would. Of course he does. Is anybody going to deny that? He's a lot closer to the truth than those guys are in that regard. But then, of course, he's a futurist, so he misses the mark on so much else.
Now, that really seems like a shining endorsement. However, he accuses Dr. Staples of going wrong on one particular point, based on what...
Many particular points, but one main one, of course, which then bleeds into all these other topics.
He can recall the article, and he admits they could be wrong about this. He says that he's under the impression that Dr. Staples is a so-called wannabe Israelite. In other words, he's a Christian. So Dr. Staples necessarily believes that he's part of the narrative and that Israelites are still being saved today.
Okay, so now Derek, right, he says that I admit that I could be wrong on this. And the reason why I admitted I could be wrong on the fact that I believe Dr. Staples was a Christian is because when I made the video while I was roaming around in my monster truck, I didn't have the recollection of who told me that. I knew someone told me that. And you're going to chuckle when you find out who it was who told me that here in a second. But I remembered somebody told me he was a Christian, and so that was in my mind. And of course, if you're a Christian and you think that the salvation mission is about you and that it didn't end when the temple fell, then you're obviously going to be looking at all these other things incorrectly and flawed as well. So let's take a look at who told me he was a Christian. It was around July 20th, so only about, a month ago. I get a text from Derek, the very same Derek that was just speaking on this video. He says this: I'm doing well, man. I've moved from the West Coast back to North Carolina. I plan to bring more to Mythvision podcast on these topics. I have an interview with Dr. Jason Staples, who proposes a theory similar to IO in Romans 9 through 11. Ready? Wait for it. Here it is. He is a Christian who thinks similar to the two-house theory. Now, folks, so I'm being accused of, making a false assumption of this guy when Derek is the one who told me that he was a Christian. I mean, come on now. Come on. All right? So I wasn't wrong. So I can't be corrected on that. I said I stand to be corrected, and I could be wrong, but I wasn't wrong because Derek told me And guess what? I knew that this guy was a Christian just by reading that 20-page article. It was obvious and apparent that he's leaving the door open, okay? He's leaving the door open so that others can come in for all eternity because he's a Christian. That's what they do. They don't recognize the eschatological nature. And if the few of them who do, they go into this view called full preterism, but they also have salvation continuing long beyond the end and the final judgment and the resurrection and all this stuff. It makes no sense. So now that we know who told me that this guy was a Christian, that being Derek of Mythvision, let's continue.
This is inconsistency at its finest, according to DaCosta. It seems like being a Christian essentially disqualifies a person from evaluating the evidence objectively. And that can happen, don't get me wrong, but he's definitely using this as an argument.
Of course I'm using this as an argument. Folks, let me ask you a question. If you're IO out there and you understand what the redemption narrative, what the reconciliation mission was all about in the New Testament, if you understand that and you're not clouded, okay, and let's say you come across a futurist Joe walks up to you, okay, and you start having this conversation, what's in your head already? Already in your mind, you're thinking to yourself, this is going to be tough because this guy already has such a flawed understanding of the scriptures. He's already putting himself in. And you have to work extra hard to get him to realize that he needs to take himself out to see the true meaning. Right? He's got too much cloud in his view. He has to step out of it first. As opposed to meeting somebody who's not a Christian who you want to talk to about IO, it's a lot easier. I have a buddy. He might even be listening to this. I go fishing with him. He's not even a Christian, never has been. His parents were. He never believed in it. And he's seen me come through these things and saw what happened to me 9 years ago or 9 years ago, 9.5. And then he was freaked out by that because that was such a radical change. But he's seen me sort of go through these views and he listens to the channel. He checks some of the stuff out. He talks to me about some of the stuff. He's not even a believer, doesn't even read the Bible, and he says, dude, what you say makes perfect sense. He's like, even I understand it now. In other words, all those years before when people would talk to me about it, it made no sense. The way that you put it makes perfect sense. And this guy's not even a believer. Now, do you think I would have that kind of reaction from somebody who has their nose in Christianity's deception for the last 30 years? I don't think so. I'm going to get kicked back. They're going to fight me on it. They're going to say, no, no, no. They're going to quote John 3:16. They're going to quote all these passages. And I'm going to have to sit there taking bullets off the chest like Rambo. All right? And just deflecting and showing them all these things. Right? It's a massive undertaking to put that back into its proper place. So when Derek says he's using this as an argument, you bet your damn life I am, buddy. You bet your damn life I am, because it needs to be used as an argument, because his understanding of who he is in this story is causing him to see everything else incorrectly. One little tweak to that little lens is all it takes. When you're in the eye chair and they're examining your eyes and they flick it so that you get your new, contact lens or glasses prescription. One little flick and your perspective changes and you can see clearly. That's all it takes. Once you see who this was for and that it ended when it ended, it all comes together like a ham and cheese sandwich. Nice and tight.
So according to DaCosta, there's a problem with Staples' theology off the top because allegedly he's not recognizing the eschatological nature of those last days. And what was all coming to a close and when that would be? That being the destruction of the temple. This is full preterism. Allegedly, he's at a disadvantage in believing that he's part of the program and part of the gospel mission. DaCosta asserts that Dr. Staples needs to come out of Christianity a little bit in order to understand that. It makes a lot more sense if we exclusify it down to Israel. But DaCosta is careful to repeatedly point out he could be wrong. He could be wrong.
I could be wrong that he's a Christian. That's why I could be wrong, Derek. Let's tell the whole story. I didn't say that I could be wrong on what I'm presenting. I said that and don't take that the wrong way. I could have a lot of things wrong, but the premise is there, and I know I'm not wrong on that. But I could be wrong on him being a Christian back then. Now that I fact check that, I found out that it isn't fake news, and that you yourself actually told me that, and that matches my internal feelings about this guy when I read his article. He is a futurist Christian. Bottom line. He is looking for the coming of the Lord. Bottom line. He is wrong. Bottom line.
And I think he actually is wrong about Dr. Staples. Now I'll try to explain why that is. As an aside, I'd like to point out that starting a critique of Dr. Staples with these accusations does seem to be a textbook example of both a straw man fallacy, not addressing the still man version of Staples' argument.
Oh, good Lord, straw man, still man. Derek, I was driving around in a monster pickup truck, okay? This wasn't a debate. This wasn't me taking the time to formally respond to this guy's points. This was me using words like wackadoodle and banana sandwich and rolling through town not giving a you-know-what, okay? That's what it was. So don't look at it as, oh, it's his affirmative and he's in the negative and this, that, and the other. It's ridiculous, okay? It's ridiculous. I gave a very casual sort of opinion presentation on the article. Okay, and I admit that maybe I got something wrong about his view, but it didn't change the overall nuts and bolts of it. It didn't change that. It still has his flawed understanding in full mind. So there's nothing, it's ridiculous. There is no straw man attempt. My attempt at laying out his position ahead of time was so that I could let my audience understand what we're working with here. Okay, if I'm going to have a Satanist on the show, okay, it's a radical example, right? But if I'm going to have a Satanist on the show, then I'm going to tell people ahead of time that this guy's a Satanist, right? I'm not just going to review his material and just kind of leave that part out, right? Leave my audience hanging. Same thing with Dr. Jason Staples. Of course, I'm going to tell my audience that he's a Christian. Pardon me. So the point is that that's not a straw man argument. That's me simply laying the framework and laying the foundation and giving the people who are listening the background information they need so that they understand why some of these points and these arguments are coming out of this guy's article. Sorry, my mom just texted me asking if I want some stuffed red peppers. Of course I want some stuffed red peppers. Anyways, back to where we were. Kind of got lost. But I was being accused of straw man stuff and dealing with the still man instead of the straw man, right? But that's nonsense, all right? If I can't have a chat while I'm rolling around in a pickup truck and tell people what the deal is with this cat before I start talking about this cat's material, then lock me up and throw me in prison.
And poisoning the well, preemptively presenting irrelevant information in order to
Irrelevant information, Derek? Irrelevant information. I don't know if you guys checked out my video from a couple days ago called The End Matters. Well, you should if you didn't, because the end matters, guys. The end matters. Like I said in that video, if Jesus says that his coming was taking place in that generation and before some standing there died, and if Jesus also says that the gospel would end at his coming, then that means that the gospel ended within one generation of when Jesus died on the cross. That's a powerful equation. That's a powerful fact. Irrelevant information, Derek? Come on. Okay, let's be real here. Very relevant.
Credit someone. So he's a Christian. Don't listen to him. He's wrong automatically. You can poison the well in these areas.
He's a Christian. Don't listen to him. Derek's not a Christian. Derek talks about how deluded and delusional Christians are very frequently. Derek talks about how he was once very delusional himself, which we'll check out here in a second. But yet I'm being criticized because I presented that information before talking about this guy's article. Do you see how wackadoodle this is?
So I'm sure DaCosta is simply trying to point out Staples' biases up front.
Okay. Then why even mention all that wackadoodle straw man stuff?
But I don't think this is valid if he can't actually point out instances where Staples' biases are getting in the way.
How about the main instance? He thinks he's an Israelite. The main instance of his bias getting in the way is that he thinks he's part of this narrative, Derek. He thinks the coming of the Lord is in the future, Derek. Here's what it does, okay? Let me tell you. If people understand that it ended at the destruction of the temple, and that it was a short work upon the earth, as Paul calls it in Romans 9, and that it was only to gather in the lost sheep of the children of Israel, then they realize that it's I.O. Because, you see, a short work upon the earth, a temporary mission to gather certain individuals, makes a lot more sense if it's restricted in its availability, or if it's limited. All right? The opposite of that is an eternal, never-ending, ongoing mission that never ends. That's a bit more complicated. But if you can understand that it ended when it did, and that all those who were Christ were raised at his coming, and then came the end, like Paul said, and there's only one coming in Scripture, then you can understand that it's I.O. You can understand that it's a lot more exclusive than we once thought.
In any case, the so-called error that DaCosta points out is this. According to Dr. Staples, as expressed by DaCosta, non-elect Gentiles are inside of the salvation narrative, along with Gentilized Israelites of the northern tribes. Here's exactly what he says in quotes. Basically, what Dr. Staples does is understands that a lot of these saved Gentiles being gathered in from the nations are actually the dispersed Israelites. They're the northern tribes. They're the paganized Israelites who've been gathered back in to fulfill the mission to save all Israel. But he then goes on to add that other Gentiles were added in alongside. So in other words, this ingathering of the Israelites from the nations would open up the door, so to speak, to allow other real Gentiles in.
Now, I'll admit, I may have gotten that wrong a bit, okay? What I said is that I believe that his article says that he believes, try to figure that one out, that alongside of the actual northern tribe Israelites were true Gentile pagans. That's what I thought it said. And I guess it didn't. I guess what it actually said, and I think Derek will clarify this here in a second for us, but I believe and I still haven't read it a second time. I'm going to. But I believe what it said is that the intermixing, if that's a word, or the interracial activity, or the mixing and the blending and the breeding would have made it so that the dispersion and the scattering of the northern tribes allowed salvation to come to the nations because of all this, this jungle dancing that's going on in the nations where people are kind of boogieing down and making sweet love and, mixing races and all this stuff. That's what the salvation's all about. Right? Go out there and intermingle and mix and have sex with other peoples. Get blended good enough, and then salvation's going to come to all the nations because you did that. Because you did that. Right? But do you see how neither one of those things makes any sense? Does it make any sense to you that God was going to scatter the Israelites into the nations so that later on, after many years of mixing with all these nations, God could then save these nations only because the Israelites had mixed with them? Does that make any sense to you? So hell no. Doesn't make any sense, okay? It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But yet, that's what these guys want us to believe. Doesn't it make more sense? Isn't it so much cleaner and clearer and more logical to understand that what the story wants you to see is that God was calling these Israelites back from the nations? That's really all it is. It's the reuniting of the two sticks of Ezekiel. It's the two houses coming together and being joined into one. It's all Israel being saved. That's what it represents. It doesn't represent these illogical theories that these wannabe Israelites have come up with.
And DaCosta claims that there are two problems with that, according to the narrative. One, the eschatological nature and how it all ended. All the elect would be raised, according to Paul in 1 Corinthians 15. And number two, the fullness of the nations had to come in by the end, which was within the generation before some of them standing there would die. So basically, if I understand DaCosta correctly, Dr. Staples is refuted by the a priori assumption that full preterism is true.
No, not that full preterism is true, Derek. That the Bible, New Testament narrative, the destruction of heaven and earth, the destruction of Mystery Babylon, the mother of all harlots, the end of the age, the not one stone left upon another, the coming of the Lord in flaming fire and vengeance, all of that took place at the destruction of the temple, which was the end of the age, which was the coming of the Lord, which was the whole shebang. That was the point when the final resurrection happened. That was the point when the final judgment happened. That was the point when the dead were raised, the living were changed, and they were caught up together in the clouds with the Lord in the air, where they would forever be with him in this new city that only had the 12 tribes' names written on it. That's the point. Okay, that's the point.
And that Paul was somehow aware of the events that would transpire after his death. But I think we can safely assume that the doctrine of full preterism is not within the scope of Dr. Staples' analysis.
The doctrine of full preterism shouldn't have to be in the scope of his analysis. The doctrine of common sense, logic, and just being dead honest with the text should be in his scope. That's the bottom line. Unfortunately, most Christians don't really take a hard look at these things, and they glance right over AD 70, not realizing that that was the apocalyptic end-of-the-world event that the New Testament speaks of.
As it's just not something that Bible scholars tend to take into consideration. So obviously, this is just something full preterists have to deal with when evaluating Bible scholarship in general. DaCosta goes on to question Dr. Staples in a way that seems to beg the question that IO doctrine is in fact established as being true. Are more than the elect coming in? Elect is always a term that refers to biological Israel, never Gentiles who have faith.
Now, first of all, I didn't say biological Israel. I know I didn't say biological Israel. I don't even use the word biological. Derek uses that word. So Derek added that word, and I didn't say it. I know that for sure, because I don't say biological Israel. I use the term Israel because I know it's a touchy subject. Israel's a covenant name, for sure. But that just was not very accurate, what he just said.
Now, I want to point out that DaCosta does...
But the term elect is always used for Israel. Israel was the elect, right? Israel, my elect, flat out, 100 times in the Old Testament. If you couldn't tell they were elect, then you probably haven't read Deuteronomy, because Moses flat out tells them that they're chosen high above all else, that God has chosen them as his possession, his portion, his elect. They were the ones, right?
Does consistently fall back on the idea that anything is possible in the realm of supernatural make-believe. The story is a supernatural tale, an ideal story that is not concerned with such historical plausibility, etc. Clearly, anything can happen in a fictitious narrative. Well, anything but the inclusion of the actual non-Israelite Gentiles into the communities Paul is addressing.
Wait for it. Oh, hell no. No, he didn't, okay? What Derek did is he tried to turn that one around on us and say that, their argument is that anything's possible in the supernatural realm of the Bible. So why can't the actual Gentiles be added in, right? Why is that too supernatural? No, that's not too supernatural, Derek. But that's not what the story's saying, right? That's not who's standing in heaven at the end. That's not the only ones that Jesus said he came for. Right? That's not what you see at the very end when the credits come on. You don't see that. You see a party in heaven, but that party's only limited to the 12 tribes. Okay, now, again, fine-tooth comb it all you want. You guys can fine-tooth comb this stuff all you want. Like, if it's only the 12 tribes of Israel, then what about Abraham, right? He wasn't of the tribes of Israel. Fine-tooth comb it all you want, my friends. But we're talking about the New Testament, the information contained there, and what it says and what it doesn't say. And what it says is that this was a mission for the 12 tribes. This was what the 12 tribes served God earnestly day and night, hoping to attain, said Paul, the apostle to the nations. This is what it was all about. So you don't have a problem with me, you have a problem with what the actual story says.
That's just illogical, according to DaCosta. Now, if anyone thinks I'm strawman...
It's illogical because it's not what the story says. I'd rather take what the Old Testament promised 100 million times, that being Israel coming back from the nations and being regathered. I'd rather take that and let that mold my understanding of what could possibly, be going on in the New Testament. I mean, I would think that's why, since the New Testament quotes the Old Testament a gazillion times, I would think that's why, since all these characters in the New Testament refer back to characters in the Old, I mean, I would think that that's probably the better way to do it, other than to sling pie theories at the wall and see if they stick like Mythvision does, right? I would actually rather look at the text and what it's saying and formulate a good, solid, logical theory. Not one that's completely opposite of what the Old Testament says. Like, the Old Testament predicts that Israel would come back from the nations over and over and over and over and over and over again. I always use Moses in Deuteronomy 4, where he says, "You, Israel, in the latter days will be paganized, scattered, worshiping wood and stone. But God will turn and have mercy upon you and remember the covenant that he made with your fathers." And that's what Paul tells them in Galatians 3. You're an heir according to the promise made with your father. You're Abraham's seed. You're an heir according to the promise. He's having mercy upon you. The same mercy that he asks about in Romans 9. Is God having mercy upon the Gentiles? And then he goes and quotes 3 passages all about Israel. One that says, if God hadn't left us a seed, we would have become like Sodom. Again, totally defeating any arguments against my view, because it shows that there was a seed of them in the nations. It didn't say anything about a mixed bag of nuts. It didn't say anything that they boogied down and made sweet love to the outer nations and, intermingled and intertwined and entangled, right? It doesn't say anything about that. It's a very clear, ideal story. Doesn't want you to sit there with the fine-tooth comb and say, well, gee, how could that be possible, right? It doesn't care about that. I'll repeat, anything's possible in the land of make-believe. So what are you doing with a fine-tooth comb, Derek?
Manning DaCosta here. I'll provide links to the first video and second video he recently put out. I'm happy to be fact-checked on this all day. Today's video basically reiterates...
Fact-check that biological Israelite comment.
all the points I just mentioned. That Jason Staples is allegedly a futurist Christian. DaCosta affirms that these futurist Christians must necessarily assume that the Israelites are still being gathered, because the fullness of the nations has not come in yet.
Is that wrong? Am I wrong there? Can someone refute that? If Jason Staples thinks that he's part of the nations coming in, and of course he would have to as a Christian, then clearly all Israel isn't saved yet. How does that work? How does that work for a futurist?
So by default, all Israel has not been saved. And this is supposedly the clincher against Dr. Staples' entire thesis. It seems like the implications is that Dr. Staples must necessarily be blinded by his religious bias that necessarily render him incapable of providing an objective analysis of the text.
Now, I got to tell you, Derek must be hard up for like a debate, just debates. I don't know. Like, I see that he's putting out all these GoFundMe things to get debates going and everything. Like, it's ridiculous. But he clearly wants somebody to debate Jason Staples, the way that he's putting this together. He's putting it together in such a way where it seems like one party's attacking the other. More so the IO view attacking Staples, of course. But again, I have to stress, people, so you understand. If I or any other IOer wanted to debate a futurist, we wouldn't have to go through all this trouble. We could just jump on Facebook and you could just flip a coin and go into any Christian group you want. There's probably a billion of them. And you could argue all day till you're blue in the face about Scripture and find a million different views, some of which probably sound like Jason Staples, some which don't, but it doesn't matter. So for Derek to try to make this into something more than what it actually is kind of laughable, because it's not worthy of an IO's time. It's just not. Right? I mean, how many times am I going to try to correct somebody's theology and try to tell them, hey, you don't belong in that story? Right? I mean, there's nothing new that's going to come from this. Great. Dr. Staples recognizes that Paul is speaking of the 10 northern tribes in Romans 9 through 11. Great job. I mean, we all do. But what is he doing with that information? Well, right now, currently, as a futurist, he's botching the whole story. He's missing what Christ said himself. His Christ was a liar, because his Christ said he was coming back in that generation and before some standing there died. His Christ told the apostles that they wouldn't finish preaching through the towns of Israel before they see the Son of Man come. So let me ask you, are any of the apostles roaming the towns of Israel today in 2020 with masks on because they don't want to get corona, even though they have the Holy Spirit and supposedly can beat the shit out of King Kong? Are any of them still roaming around? Absolutely not. Therefore, either Jesus lied or you missed the coming.
Now that's an interesting aspect of DaCosta's view that's worth pointing out here.
I don't know, I missed that one. Sorry, I'm chewing ice. But Derek's got a little bit of an advertisement here. Hang on, I'm going to skip it here. Sorry, Derek, I just robbed you of 3 cents. All right.
On the one
Let's go back.
hand, the epistles of Paul are supposedly fictional. Now, I don't know what this means exactly. Perhaps they're epistolary fiction, like they were written to fake audiences and describing made-up situations. Epistolary fiction was a thing in the ancient world. However, DaCosta and other IOers seems to frequently contradict this view by claiming that there were, in fact, in actual history, ethnically distinct paganized northern Israelites dispersed throughout the Roman Empire in the 1st century AD.
Absolutely. And I take that view because, of course, there's evidence for it, okay? You have Josephus's quote, which Derek is going to try to skew and shrink down its power, right? But you're going to laugh because Derek's actually going to, he's not going to realize it. I'll point it out. But he's actually going to refer to the he's going to refer to the 10 northern tribes through Josephus the same way that John in Revelation does about the great multitude from all the nations, right? And he's not picking up on it, or at least he is, and he's acting like he's not. But you got Josephus, you got the book of the Maccabees, right? Now, you got a lot of history in that time period, from the Assyrian the Assyrian conquest down the Babylonian conquest. Then you got the Maccabean stuff that went on there a couple hundred years before Christ. And you have proof that all these Israelites are kind of in and out, taken away, brought back, taken away, moved out, leaving the law, leaving the Sabbath, leaving the covenant, right? All this stuff going on through the years. Now, if you're Derek, you fine-tooth comb the hell out of that, right? You say, oh, well, this can't be true unless I have a letter written from someone in that time frame directly to me to prove the point. Right? That's what these guys would like you to have. It's like an actual document stating, yes, there were Israelites in the 1st century beyond the Euphrates. Sincerely, Mr. 1st Century. Right? Makes no sense. There's proof. There's Josephus proof. There's Maccabees proof. There's a shitload of Old Testament proof. A ton of it. That Israelites were going out to the nations. A ton of it. These guys are like, oh, there's no proof, there's no proof. There's tons of proof. Whoever wrote the Old Testament, that's all they wrote about. Did you ever think about that? I mean, these guys would argue that it's retrospective. In other words, a lot of these things happened before they were written about. Okay, so if that's the case, then think about how many of these writers wrote about Israelites in the nations. If they're writing retrospectively, in other words, looking back on things that happened, and they're writing that Israel's out in the nations and she's going to be coming back, and that she's scattered everywhere. No matter where she is, God is going to find her and bring her back. Think about the reality of what must have been going on. Think about the New Testament authors like James, Peter. James wrote to the 12 tribes scattered abroad. Right? I think James, they say, was written in the 40s. Excuse me. Now, of course, they would have their fallback arguments. Well, the dating's all nonsense. It was written in the hundreds. Doesn't matter when it was written. Whoever wrote James, okay, understood that there were 12 tribes scattered abroad, or at least had knowledge that that was a concept or a thing. Now, Derek, I believe, eventually reads something from Jason Staples, a reply that where he admits that. He admits there's a couple schools of thought. There's one school of thought that says, yes, they were in existence, and there's another school of thought that says, no, they weren't. But it's important to understand that in these types of discussions and arguments, there's always conflicting views. Always. It's just like the dating of the book of Revelation. People fight that, Revelation, that it was written before AD 70, right? If you look at the book, if you look at the proof, there's exterior proof. People fight. It's written in the 60s, guaranteed. But then you have all the futurists who just, kind of blindly follow what's told to them anyway. They all say, no, it was written in 95 AD, right? But if it was written in 95 AD about events that are shortly to come to pass, then you have in your hands a very fake letter that means nothing. If it was written in the 70s or in the 60s, before the destruction of the mother of all harlots, Old Covenant Jerusalem, then you might have something special in your hands. It's just not about you. There's a big difference there. But they don't, there's conflicting evidence. Oh, this guy said this. No, but this guy said that. Oh, this guy doesn't believe they were there. Oh, this guy believes they were there. It's just all over the place. So what I like to do is I like to kind of say, all right, well, what does the evidence say? Right? The evidence says that they were there. Whoever wrote this story, if it was written pre-70, if it was written in 200 AD, whoever wrote this story clearly knew the 12 tribes were out in the nations. Or at the very least, that was their tradition. That was what they were told. That was what they hoped would happen. Plain and simple. Let's continue to see Derek try to argue that the 10 tribes were not out in the nations. You know what's funny is people today still think that the 12 tribes are going to come back, right? There's groups out there that actually believe in this crap, that the 12 tribes are going to come back, that they're being preserved, right? Look at the black Hebrew Israelites. Those idiots think that they're the 12 tribes. So don't act as if this type of position is new or, totally, organic to our position. It's not. People have seen a lot of these elements for a long time, a very long time. It's just now that we're getting to the real foundation where this ended relatively quickly and it was a short mission. That's the game changer.
He frequently supports this assertion by quoting a single passage in Josephus and by referencing the Maccabean literature. He dismisses any skepticism in his historical proposition. So just take note of this apparent contradiction here. 1. Either we're dealing with fake epistles written to fake Christian audiences that consist exclusively of Israelites, regardless of who these people were in actual history, or we're dealing with real letters written to real people who actually existed in history. And these people were all actually Jews or distinct paganized northern Israelites. I'll just keep this issue in mind. I'll touch on it later, so just don't forget about that. Now let's transition from DaCosta and take a look at what Dr. Staples actually says to determine if DaCosta is accurately characterizing the Stillman version of Dr. Staples' thesis. You can judge for yourself. In terms of what Staples posted on Bart Ehrman's blog in July and August, most of it recapitulates the content of his 20-page article.
So there you have it. Derek admits that the articles that Staples put on Ehrman's site, the 3 articles, recapitulate or basically just review what's in his 2011 article. Thank you, Derek. You just saved me time and effort that I don't need to put in at looking at those articles.
I'll provide links to the blog post. Those who want to explore it, he made 3 posts in total. By the way, he responds to questions. So if you want to ask him a question, he responds. And I've asked the IOers to please write questions, and I'd like to see the engagement of what he responds to the IOers who are promoting their view.
Yeah, but again, why would we need to question a futurist, Derek? I mean, what? It's almost like Derek forgot about some fundamental stuff here. Why am I going to question a futurist? Because he has a doctor in front of his name? Derek, come on. Dr. Don K. Preston, Dr. John Hagee, Dr. John MacArthur, Dr. Robert Price. I mean, look, a lot of men have a DR in front of their name. It doesn't impress me very much, okay? That's just me, right? I work with doctors. That's my line of work. I work with all sorts of different medical and dental doctors. So I'm around doctors quite a bit, but it's not impressive, right? What's impressive is how you handle the truth when it's presented to you. So Derek's acting as if there's something there, like, oh, these guys don't want to ask Jason Staples questions. No, I don't have to ask Jason Staples questions because I don't find his view to be sexually attractive. Right? His view is not sexually attractive to me. It doesn't turn me on.
Trying to test him because this would be the guy that's so close, you know?
Well, Derek just said this is the guy that's so close, but in the beginning he said that we hailed victory even though Staples is not close. So I'm a little confused. Is he close or is he not close?
One on these posts, he says, what does Paul mean by all Israel will be saved? The post number 2 on Ehrman's blog, why does Paul switch from talking about Jews to Israel? And post number 3 is, did Jesus fail to restore Israel? Paul's solution to the problem. I do want to touch on a couple of things that Dr. Staples wrote in the blog post and in the comments underneath the post, which may be helpful for this analysis. Someone in the comments asked Dr. Staples to define the term Gentile. Here's his answer. Quote, Gentile is just an English rendering of the ancient Hebrew and Greek words for nation, goy, and ethnos, respectively.
Now, this is what I meant about valuable insight when I said, when Derek accused me of victory flapping this or victory flagging this, I don't know what he said. But I did say that a lot of this guy's information backs up I.O. Like, for instance, what Derek's about to read to you here. Somebody asked this guy, Jason Staples, what the word Gentile is. And you just heard him say that it's pretty much a made-up word that came a long time after, and that it actually, the real word means just nations. And what I want you guys to pick up is in Dr. Staples' answer, notice how he says that the term could be used to speak of individuals and nations, people living in nations, right? I want you to pay attention to that because that's very important. Because if that is the case, and of course it is, then that means that when it said that many of these Gentiles are coming in, all that's being said there is people from the nations are coming in. People from the nations, right? It's not as specific. It's not as specific, oh, that's a Gentile, that's a pagan, that's nobody connected to Israel. No, it just meant somebody living outside of the confines of Judaism, living outside in the nations. Ready? Check it out.
In the Hebrew Bible, the nations are the various people groups across the earth, of which Israel is the one specifically chosen to be Yahweh's covenant people.
Interesting how he notes that.
On occasion, the nations is used as shorthand to refer to the nations other than Israel. This latter use of the term becomes more common in the literature of late Second Temple period, and in the New Testament, the nations almost always refers to everyone else. Paul uses the collective noun nations or nation to refer both to non-Jewish groups and to individuals within those people groups, akin to using America to
individuals within those people groups. Notice how he said non-Jewish groups. I like that. Finally, somebody used it right. Okay, you get all these people that conflate the two terms, Jew and Israel. Okay, but it seems like he knows how to use that term in the first century, because let's not forget that the Jews were referred to as Israel. It's very, very tricky because the Jewish nation was referred to as Israel. Right? Yet not all Israel was true Israel, said Paul. There was an Israel of God, and Israel was scattered far and wide.
Refer to the collective or to Americans, a use that we also find in later rabbinic literature. I can't, or at least won't, go into more detail here, but if you're really interested in more detail, I suggest taking a look at Ishay Rosenzai, I may not be pronouncing his last name correct, and Adi Afir's 2018 book, Goy, which engages in a highly detailed and quite technical, theoretical at times, history of the term. Their hypothesis, which I'm sure I fully agree with, is that Paul's use of the term to refer to individuals is in fact an innovation.
Perfect. So it's an innovation. It's been invented. It doesn't exist. Paul's use of the term to refer to individuals as like, he's a Gentile. No, that doesn't exist. Paul was an apostle to the nations, not the Gentiles. And he was an apostle to the nations for the purpose of gathering in the elect.
End quote. I'll post a link in the description to the article by Rosenzai, I hope I'm pronouncing it correct, and Ophir, about the term Gentile. In any case, anyone who wants to check it out, I'll post a link to the blog post and to Staples' article. Here are a couple of key sections from Staples' second and third post. Quote, putting the pieces together, Paul appears to read Hosea as a twofold prophecy. Twofold. Each directly involving Gentiles or Gentile status. First, Northern Israel would no longer be distinct from the rest of the nations. They effectively become Gentiles. This does not seem to be what happened with the Northern Israelites who were scattered by Assyria. They intermarried with other peoples, thus assimilating into those groups and ceasing to be their own separate ethnic group. But
that's interesting. It's interesting how he says this does not seem to be what happened to the northern tribes. Yet, we're not talking about what seems to be. We're talking about what's said, right? Because, again, I have to stress, for Dr. Jason Staples, it's different because he's looking at this book as if it involves him. He's looking at it as the almighty, infallible Word of God. So he believes everything. He hangs his hat on everything that it says. If he's a Christian, that's one of the things you do, right? You're proud of it. So for him, it has to make sense. For him, he's going to look with a fine-tooth comb and say, well, where's all the proof that these Israelites were existing out in the nations, right? I expect that from him. But from Derek, and from guys like Derek, to be looking at the narrative with such a fine-tooth comb is inconsistency at its finest. Because if you're going to look at the promise of Israel being brought back from the nations unblemished and cleansed, right, like a bride, then you're going to have a hard time. Because these concepts are just symbolic imagery. It's hopeful expectation. It's La La Land fairy tale, okay? And it was written by people or a person who clearly wanted this to take place. It doesn't matter if it was possible. It doesn't matter if they were mixed or if they were still existing in small regions as groups of ethnic peoples. It doesn't matter, right? That doesn't matter. The story's not concerned with that. The story is ideal. The story shows that son, that prodigal son, coming back to the father at the end, and the father accepting him and being reunited. And if you think about that parable here, the parable of the prodigal son, in one of the accounts, it shows that the brother who stayed home was jealous, right? He was jealous when he saw the love that the father was having on the brother who came back from the nations. Well, that's kind of funny because it says, jealousy has come until, I don't know, what I'm talking about, where Paul says something about in order to provoke them to jealousy, salvation has come to you or something like that. In other words, here's Israel out in the nations being forgiven. These dirty, dirty Israelites, these ones who the Jews referred to as Gentile and unclean and pagan and dirty and nasty, right? Heathens. These ones were coming back. God was having mercy upon them and remembering the covenant that he made with their father. And here's the Jews who had stayed with Papa God all along, albeit not very diligently. They were, what did Jesus call them? A den of thieves, or I don't know, maybe that's a movie, I don't know. But he basically called them, whitewashed tombs full of dead man's bones. So, but they're looking upon the salvation that's coming to the nations and they're getting jealous. Same exact picture of the prodigal son, where the two brothers are. One stays home, one goes away and rolls around with the filth of the nations, but then comes back. It's all right there.
At some later time, and this is the part Paul specifically quotes, God will restore Israel from being not my people, Gentiles. To put it plainly, much of Israel has gone native and become Gentiles. So now God is fulfilling his promise to restore Israel by incorporating Gentiles.
But didn't this guy just say that Gentiles was an innovation and that it really isn't a term? He said much of Israel has become Gentiles, right? But all that means is much of Israel was living in the nations. That's all that means. Right? Do you see that? I hope you see that. On one hand, they say that Israel was going to become Gentile. But on the other hand, he says that Gentile's not really a word and it should just mean nation. So all that it really means is that Israel was existing in the nations. That's it.
The Assyrians were experts at breaking up rebellious people groups. Their primary strategy was to deport much of the population, dispersing them among different regions of the Assyrian Empire, ensuring that they were spread too thin to unify and rebel again. And within a few generations, these dispersed groups would typically intermarry among the other people groups in those areas, effectively losing their distinct ethnic identity and becoming melting pot Assyrians. Such practices are considered genocide by today's standards.
Now, I got to show you guys something. So here's Derek and Dr. Staples. Now, they're right. Historically, the Assyrians were a ruthless force. They would break up their people in such an intelligent, methodical way so that they didn't come back and rebel. A lot of these kingdoms did this same thing, right? But this is what I mean, right? They're fine-tooth combing details that don't need to be fine-tooth combed. Check this out. Check this promise out from Ezekiel 36. And I want you to tell me, okay, does this sound like God was going to mix his people in with other people and then bring back a whole mixed bag o' nuts? Like that was his whole purpose, right? Or the other option, in my opinion, the more logical option, does this sound like God is going to preserve his people, and it doesn't matter how that's possible, right? You're not supposed to think about that. But God's going to preserve his people and bring them back, plain and simple. I'm going to read it to you. Verse 16 of Ezekiel 36. Moreover, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, when the house of Israel dwelt in their own land, they defiled it by their own ways and deeds. To me, their way was like the uncleanness of a woman in her customary impurity. Therefore, I poured out my fury on them for the blood they had shed on the land, and for their idols which they had defiled it. So I scattered them among the nations, and they were dispersed throughout the countries. I judged them according to their ways and their deeds. When they came to the nations, wherever they went, they profaned my holy name. When they said of them, These are the people of the Lord, and yet they have gone out of his land. But I had concern for my holy name, which the house of Israel had profaned among the nations wherever they went. Therefore, say to the house of Israel, Thus says the Lord your God, I do not do this for your sake, O house of Israel, but for my name's sake, which you have profaned among the nations wherever you went. And I will sanctify my great name, which has been profaned among the nations, says the Lord God, when I am hallowed in you, Israel, before their eyes. Check it out. For I will take you, Israel, from among all the nations, gather you out of all the countries, and bring you into your own land. Then I will sprinkle clean water upon you, and you shall be clean. I will cleanse you from all your filthiness and from all your idols. Now, holy cow, does not that sound like the baptism in the New Testament? I will take you from all the nations, gather you out of all the countries, and bring you into your own land. Then I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you will be clean. I will cleanse you from all your filthiness and from all your idols. Folks, if that's not a picture of their sins being washed away, and them being baptized in the water and come up clean, the New Testament, that is exactly what's going on here. But notice here in Ezekiel, the focus is on Israel coming back from the nations and being washed clean. Now, what do you think makes more sense of the New Testament? True pagans who never knew God being washed clean of sins that they didn't know they were committing? Or Israelites having the fulfillment of a promise made long ago come to fruition and their sins being washed away? Didn't Paul tell them that Jesus nailed their trespasses to the cross? That the handwritten requirements that were against them was nailed to the cross? Of course he did. Didn't Paul say that by nature some of them did the things contained in the law of Moses and thereby showed the work of the law was written on their hearts? That's Romans chapter 2. Of course he did. But he tells them here in Ezekiel that he would take the Israelites and cleanse them. He would give them a new heart and put a new spirit within them. I will take the heart of stone out of your flesh, it says, and give you a heart of flesh. I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my laws, and you will keep my judgments and do them. Then you will dwell in the land that I gave to your fathers. You shall be my people, and I will be your God. I will multiply the fruit of your trees, increase your fields. Then you will remember your evil ways and deeds, and you will loathe yourself in your own sight for your iniquities and your abominations. Thus says the Lord God, on the day that I cleanse you from all your iniquities, I will also enable you to dwell in the cities, and the ruins shall be rebuilt. And of course, we know that a lot of this is speaking of their return to Jerusalem, but the point that I really need you guys to pick up on here is that everything that the Old Testament prophets, and it's all over the place, it's not just in Ezekiel, everything they say is about Israel. And everything they say is what we see taking place in the New Testament. Ezekiel predicted that Israelites would come back from the nations, they would be washed clean, their sins would be forgiven, they would be given a new heart, God would put his spirit within them, and he would bless them again. And here we have a picture in the New Testament of individuals from the nations and what's happening with them. He's cleansing them, he's forgiving them from their idols, he's giving them a new heart, and he's putting a spirit within them. And he's blessing them. Do you see the consistency? So what I need you to ask yourself right now is Derek being consistent with the story? Are they being consistent? Because remember, they would tell you that there's no way. They would have to be mixed. They would have to be intermarried and intermixed and breeded with other nations. And there's no way that you could get any true Israelites out of that scenario. But what did I just read you? I read you promises from the Old Testament that say that Israel was going to be in the nations, in the countries, and then he would finally, at some point, gather them from all these countries. Now, does it seem like God, through that Old Testament prophet, had the same concerns that Derek does? In other words, does it seem like God wanted the readers of that Old Testament prophecy to ask themselves, well, how could that be possible? They'd be mixed, right? No. It doesn't. Whoever wrote this, if you say it's God, if you say it's Ezekiel, whoever wrote it clearly didn't have the same concerns that Derek and his fine-tooth comb did. Clearly, all they wanted the readers to understand is that A, Israel would be in the nations for a long period of time, and B, God would eventually bring them back. Period. That's it. There's no fine-tooth combing that. There's two details, and that's all you should focus on. When you start fine-tooth combing it and say, well, that's not possible because Johnny Hoo-Ha would have stuck his little Willy Woo into Susie Q and they would have mixed, then you get in over your head and you lose the whole point of the story. Again, I stress that this is an ideal fairy tale type tale and it all works perfectly without the fine-tooth comb. Let's continue.
This is ultimately what happened to the northern kingdom of Israel. As Assyria deported large portions of the population, scattering them into separate areas for a theologically charged and hyperbolic account of these deportions, see 2 Kings 17, end quote. Another question that was posed to Staples on the second blog post relates to the Josephus passage that DaCosta keeps referencing as proof that there were, in fact, northern Israelites dispersed throughout the Roman Empire.
Well, clearly Josephus existed in the first century, and clearly Josephus makes a very, very damning comment. And I'm sure there's a million other comments that you could find if you read through this guy's boatload of material that prove that they were, or at least they thought they were, or at least that was the myth or the tradition. This is what I'm saying. It's not necessarily that this stuff is actually true historically to the T, but rather that this is what they believed and this is what they had traditionally talked about. And it makes perfect sense.
I'll give you the whole passage in question.
Why wouldn't it be the case when the whole story leading up to the first century is about Israel's dispersions and scatterings and punishments and exiles and Maccabean revolt and, giving up the law and abandoning circumcision and reversing circumcision? Why wouldn't this be why wouldn't they want this to be what the New Testament is about? Why wouldn't this be a victorious story of Israel's redemption and salvation? Why wouldn't it be? Does it make more sense for it to be about Gentiles? I don't think so.
provide a link below to provide context for the question I'm about to read. This is what Josephus says in Antiquities Book 11, Chapter 5, Section 2, line 133. Quote, "But then the entire body of the people of Israel, Israelites, remained in that country." The entire body of the...
Notice how Derek's repeating that, because that kind of goes against his claims, because here's Josephus saying that the entire body of Israelites remained in that country. Well, how could he have said that? According to Derek and these other guys, these entire bodies of Israelites just didn't exist. They just somehow were intermingled, and they just dispersed and became other people groups. I'm telling you, they're getting into dangerous territory with these assumptions. They should just let the story say what it says.
The people of Israel, Israelites, remained in that country. Wherefore there are but 2 tribes in Asia and Europe subject to the Romans. Only 2. While the 10 tribes are beyond the Euphrates till now.
Notice Josephus in the 1st century speaking of the 2 tribes under Roman control and the 10 tribes beyond the Euphrates until now. Let's see what Derek does with it.
And are an immense multitude, and not to be estimated by numbers.
Now Derek's face got a little red there, because Derek, being the astute Bible student that he was and that he is, understands where that terminology is found in the Bible, right? Here you have Josephus saying that the 10 tribes beyond the Euphrates are an immense number not to be estimated. And Derek, I can assure you, in his head, thought of Revelation chapter 7. Because in Revelation 7, John looks and sees a great multitude, far too great to estimate. And guess where that great multitude came in from? The nations. The nations. Guess what that connects back to? Genesis 48, the promise that Ephraim would become a fullness of nations. That is, Ephraim's descendants would become a fullness of nations. That's exactly what's taking place here. Ephraim's descendants are the great multitude from the nations. That's the fullness of the nations that Paul spoke of. Ephraim's descendants is the fullness of the nations coming in, and in this way, all Israel was saved. That's the whole point. And Derek saw that.
Interesting. End quote. The interesting part's not part of the quote, but that's just me saying that out loud to emphasize. Now, Josephus clearly states that Asia and Europe were home to only 2 tribes, and that the remaining 10 are beyond the Euphrates. However, there seems to be a very popular opinion among Iowers that beyond the Euphrates somehow encompasses Asia Minor. Pause 1 second here. I am going to exit this so I don't hear it. Okay.
Beyond the Euphrates can encompass a lot of places. I've never said that it encompasses Asia Minor specifically.
Beyond the Euphrates somehow encompasses Asia Minor. To illustrate this point, here's a map posted recently in an IO group that illustrates Ephraim.
Now, Derek gets into posting these maps. Now, it's funny how they split hairs over such, minuscule details just to find something to disagree with IO on. Right? Did Josephus say that the 10 tribes were beyond the Euphrates until now? Yes, he did. That settles it. That settles it. They are beyond the Euphrates. It doesn't matter what IOers Derek came across and might have argued over Asia Minor not being beyond the Euphrates. That's irrelevant. What's relevant is, in those nations beyond the Euphrates, Josephus very clearly in the 1st century said the 10 northern tribes existed.
Being dispersed all over the West. Note, however, that this map doesn't illustrate Ephraim's dispersion as far as Spain, which is where Paul claims he was going in Romans 15:24.
Again, fine-tooth combing it. I don't understand why. As if these Israelites couldn't be spread further abroad than what this particular map, created by a, human being at some point, depicts.
After passing through Rome.
He shows the map. He shows the other map where Ephraim was, with all these arrows pointing everywhere. Pretty clear. We don't have to fine-tooth comb it.
Where the Euphrates is on that map, on the far right, Now, with that in mind, here's a question that was asked to Dr. Staples in the comments regarding Josephus' passage. Quote, if Josephus claims there were numerous descendants of the northern tribes beyond the Euphrates, and that only the southern tribes returned, why do you suggest that the Assyrians effectively, ethnically cleansed them out of existence, and that there were no 12 tribes in Jesus' day? Do you mean that there were simply no 12 tribes in that particular region in Jesus' day? Or do you outright discredit Josephus' account? 2 Kings 17:6 says that the king of Assyria settled Israel in Halah and Habor, on the river of the Gozan, and in the cities of Medes. 2 Esdras 13:39-49 claims that 9 tribes were miraculously led across the Euphrates and wandered for a year and a half to a distant region called Arzareth, another land, where allegedly human beings had never lived, or had ever lived.
So you see all these things, right, about these tribes and how they'd be out there and all the, like, you can tell that this was something that was pretty common, right? In the Old Testament, like I had said earlier, we always see these promises of Israel being gathered, brought back. We see in the passages that Derek quotes there that it actually says that they were settled there by the Assyrians in certain regions and whatnot. So the concept's really not that far-fetched, but someone's asking Dr. Staples here, what his opinion is of this particular idea that they were out there, right? We're fine-tooth combing it again, but it's fine. Let's hear what he has to say.
It goes on to prophesy their return in the end times, when the Most High will miraculously lead them home. If it was a common knowledge that the lost tribes were in that particular location, why don't we see a concerted effort on the part of early Christians in the New Testament to spread the gospel to those lost Israelites in particular? End quote. Here is Staples' answer to that question. Quote, good question. The best explanation is that the perspective of Josephus and 2nd Esdras was not common knowledge in that period. They present only one of quite a few opinions for the fate of the northern tribes in operation in that period.
So again, it goes to the whole, there's differing opinions. But yes, there's always differing opinions. There's differing opinions on the dating of Revelation. There's differing opinions on the dating of the New Testament. There's differing opinions on the dating of the Old Testament. And there's differing opinions of whether or not the northern kingdom Israelites were still out in the nations, right? Who cares if there's differing opinions?
There's a debate in the Mishnah, for example, in which one of the rabbis, R. Joshua, argues that the nations scattered by the Assyrians no longer exist as ethnically distinct entities. Yad 4, verse 4. Other sources, such as Tobit, have other perspectives on the issue. There also no evidence for Josephus' claim that there were 10 distinct Israelite tribes across the Euphrates somewhere. It seems to have been a matter of faith for him, not an empirical claim.
So again, showing what I said, again, Josephus and what Staples actually just said, that it was more of a faith for him and couldn't really be backed up, proves perfectly what I've been saying. This is tradition. This is their myth. This is their legend. This is, what they hoped for. This was their, victorious return that they had imagined and dreamed of, right? And here he is writing about it, right? So it doesn't matter if it's true. This is why I'm saying, stop looking at things with the fine-tooth comb. You're not going to figure it all out historically. You're not going to plug in all the pieces historically. The framework is there, and the concepts are pretty ironclad as to who they are about.
End quote. Here's part of a follow-up response to Staples. Quote, in terms of the other options available in the first century Jews, Christians, are there any empirical claims that the 10 lost tribes dispersed among the nations were still ethnically distinct entities, contra Rabbi Joshua, that had since moved west into the dispersion of the Roman Empire, separate from the Jewish diaspora, southern tribes, end quote? Here's Jason's response, Dr. Staples. Those who thought there were still ethnically distinct entities typically imagine them as across the Euphrates somewhere in the east.
So now, mind you, there are those, Dr. Staples is admitting that there are those who thought that the Israelites lived still completely, I guess, ethnically, as Derek just said, out beyond the Euphrates, out in the nations.
Note that Josephus draws the distinction between those who are under the Roman Empire, those from the southern tribes, and the remnant of the other 10 tribes, which he envisions as an innumerable multitude somewhere in the east.
The same thing that John envisioned out of the nations, by the way.
Potential point of contact for the idea of the Israelite remnants in the west is Hosea 11, verse 10. His children will come trembling from the Mediterranean Sea, but that's tenuous at best. I think it's probably more accurate to say that the earliest Christians who left records thought Israel had been scattered to the four corners of the earth.
Did you hear that? The earliest Christians who left records made it obvious that they thought Israel was scattered to the four corners of the earth. This is Dr. Jason Staples. And now, interestingly enough, Jesus says, when he's commissioning them to go out and seek these sheep, he sends them where? To the four corners of the earth. They would be gathered in from the four winds of the earth. Right? Now, check this out. I'm going to blow your mind. Jesus says that he would gather in his elect from the four winds of the earth, right? When he sets forth the mission. And no, it wasn't just to Jerusalem. He told them that it would go to all nations and then the end would come. But he sets them out to go to the four winds of the earth. Well, guess what? In Revelation 7, we see the prophecy that he told the wind and the trees and the sea not to harm, anything in the four winds of the earth. The four angels who stand at the four winds of the earth. I can't recall if I'm reciting that properly, but you know what I mean. And look what it says. It says, until they're all sealed, until all the servants of God are sealed. That sealing is the Holy Spirit. So it tells them, in the four winds of the earth, don't harm the earth, the tree, the seas, until all the servants of God are sealed on the forehead. And then what does it say? It says the number of the servants that were sealed was 144,000, 12,000 from each tribe of the 12 tribes of Israel. So it tells you exactly who these ones being sealed are. They're the 12 tribes. But the interesting thing to note is where they're coming from. He's telling these angels at the four winds of the earth not to harm anything, right? Take it easy until they're all sealed. Jesus said he would not lose one. Take it easy until they're all sealed. Don't harm the earth, the wind, the trees, or the sea until all the servants of our God are sealed on the forehead. And I heard the number, 144K of the 12 tribes of Israel, 12,000 from each tribe. There it is. Jesus commissions them to go seek the elect from the four winds of the earth. Here we have Revelation showing the picture of the four winds of the earth and showing the sealing that's going on within the four winds of the earth. And it's only for the 12 tribes of Israel. So that's the whole story wrapped up in a nutshell with a little red bow on it. That's the reality here. Okay? But if you notice that when guys like Jason Staples, and well, specifically Jason Staples because he's a Christian and I guess he believes the Bible to be the infallible Word of God, or at least the Word of God, when they reject that this is Israel coming back in the New Testament, they're also rejecting the Old Testament. Because on the one hand, you have Staples saying, that can't be, that's not possible. People argue that the northern tribes may not have even been around in the first century. They may not have even existed as a people anymore. That can't be. But yet he's ignoring everything the Old Testament predicted about this very event. He's ignoring the natural trajectory of the story throughout the Old Testament so that when it gets to the New Testament, you have this culminating end of all things. These last days. The wrapping up of the story. The fairy tale itself. So that's something that we have to take a look at, is how he is actually rejecting what those Old Testament passages spoke of at length, that being the coming back of Israel from the nations.
To the ends of the earth, and therefore had been scattered and intermingled everywhere. I do think James 1 verse 1 and 1 Peter understand the tribes of Israel as having been scattered and mixed everywhere, and have adopted the same view that the next post argues is reflected in Paul, understanding those Gentiles who have been incorporated in the Jesus movement as members of a renewed 12-tribe Israel, and
also it's a renewed 12-tribe Israel, like a new version, 12 tribes of Israel 2.0.
effectively resurrected Israelites. I don't think there's strong evidence that the Gentile converts imagined themselves as biological descendants of Jacob.
No, but Paul told them they were, right? Well, first of all, there is some evidence. There is evidence that they kind of knew, right? Because what does Paul tell them in Romans 2? He says, you who by nature don't have the law, but sometimes do the things written in the law of Moses, you show that the work of the law is written on your heart, and therefore excuse yourself or accuse yourself in the day of wrath. So in other words, what he's saying is you sometimes do the things that the law requires. You sometimes actually, by maybe habit or tradition or passed down tradition, whatever it was, or maybe you were actually observing the law. Maybe you were once walking according to the course of this world, as Paul said, but then had kind of left. So maybe you do some of the things that the law requires by nature, and then you accuse yourself because you show that you know you should be doing this stuff. That's what he tells them in Romans. So there is proof of that, right? And there's also many, many instances where Paul flat out tells them that they're Israelites. For instance, Galatians 3. Doesn't matter if you're Jew or Greek, slave or free, if you're Christ, it's because you're Abraham's seed and an heir according to promise. Now, obviously, in our Bibles it says, then you're Abraham's seed, but then is the same thing as saying it's because. So if you're Christ, then you're Abraham's seed. Or if you're Christ, it's because you're Abraham's seed. In other words, if you're Christ, it bears witness to the fact that you're Abraham's seed and an heir according to the promise. In other words, you've received the Holy Spirit of Revelation 7 that we just said was for the 12 tribes of Israel in the four winds of the earth, wherever they were. So it all wraps up beautifully, right? Think about how powerful this is and how guys like Derek and Jason Staples don't take into account the fact that the mission shows that not even one sheep would be lost. Can you imagine that? Jesus comes on the scene, commissions them to go out, tells them they're going into all four winds of the earth, to the ends of the land, to all the nations, and then the end would come. So it was already, from the beginning, it was a nationwide mission, right, for certain individuals, but people argue with that. They say, oh, no, we have to differentiate the two. No, not at all. The mission from this supposed sovereign figure was already set forth. And the elect were already chosen, mind you. These were already predestined individuals who God had chosen. This is the whole point. This is the fluff and the supernatural aspect of the story. These ones are being somewhat preserved wherever they are. Paul had said in Romans 9, unless he had left us a remnant, we would have become like Sodom and been made like Gomorrah, showing that there was a remnant in the nations. But just think about that. Not even one sheep would be lost. His sheep hear his voice and they come, they know him. He wouldn't lose one, he would seek them out. He gives the analogy of if 99 are found and one goes astray, he would lay his life on the line to bring the one back. Do you realize how special these characters are supposed to be in this story? They're being portrayed as these chosen diamonds. And he was going to seek them out no matter how far and wide he had to go. And Peter says that he wasn't slack concerning the promise, but he was waiting patiently until they all came to repentance. All the ones who needed to. That was the mission. And that's what they were seeking out from the four winds of the earth. So think about the aspect of the not losing one sheep. Think about that aspect and then take into consideration what these people are arguing for when they say that anyone could come, right? Jason Staples, anyone can come. It's a mission for anyone. It can't be a mission because it's just a mission for anyone, but it's a mission for anyone. Anyone can come. A whole, entanglement of pagan and Israelite mixtures, mixed bag o' nuts. Everybody can come. And so that's the story to these guys, right? That doesn't make very much sense. Let's continue here.
Paul refers to them as descendants of the patriarchs, but he emphasizes they become such by receiving the Spirit and participation in Christ.
I think he's got it backwards. He says they become descendants of Abraham by receiving the Spirit and baptism into Christ. No, they were verified as being descendants of Abraham by that receiving of the Spirit and the baptism into Christ. That's the true story. If they were Christ's, it showed that they were Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. That's the real story. right? It doesn't work the other way. Think about how wackadoodle, I mean, the story's already wackadoodle, but think about how wackadoodle times 2 it gets if that's what this story is actually about. You mean to tell me that people are trying to become a descendant of Abraham? That's essentially what these guys are saying. You want to become a descendant of Abraham, so you put your faith in Jesus and that makes you a descendant of Abraham? I mean, how wackadoodle could we get? It's craziness, right? But it makes a hell of a lot more sense, and it's a lot more logical if it is intended to be speaking of Abraham's descendants, right? The descendants, and those of the descendants who had faith. It wasn't to Abraham and to his seed through the law, Paul said. It was to them through faith. Still doesn't extend beyond Abraham and his seed, the chosen ones.
The first person plurals, especially 1 Corinthians 10 verse 1, and his insistence that Abraham is the father of all the faithful, Romans 4 verse 12 through 16, work pretty powerfully together on that front.
Correct, but all the faithful can also be contextually limited, right? That brings up another point. Derek knows this, and Derek has somehow gone away from this. But if you, actually, I'm going to let you in on a little secret here, and I hope Derek doesn't mind. But if you search Derek Lambert Salvation or something on YouTube, or here's one, Calvinism is True, Derek Lambert, you'll find Derek's old channel where he's got, 150 subscribers or whatever. And he's got a bunch of videos when he was in the Christian movement. And you'll see a ton of them where he's talking about all not meaning all as in everyone. See, Derek was a huge Calvinist. If you look at some of these videos, Derek fights for Calvinism in them. I'm going to let you listen to a clip from one right here. Here's Derek about, 8 years ago.
Okay, limited atonement. Okay, for God so loved the world, or he is the propitiation for our sins, but not only ours, but for the whole world. Here's the thing. You have either Christ dies for everyone, and everyone is saved. Christ dies for everyone, but not everyone's saved, and he fails. And if he didn't fail, then you have to factor in man's doing. You have to.
All right, so that's Derek. He's looking like Jebediah something on there, like he belongs on. What was that old show? God, I can't even remember. But that's him talking. Let's see if we can catch a little bit more here.
Look it up. Watch debates. Get involved and don't let your emotions. You need to check. You need to fear God. You need to work out your salvation if you're in trembling, even though that's a sanctification. Brothers and sisters, this is why I'm a Calvinist.
Okay, so Derek was a Calvinist, all right? He was a fighter for the Calvinistic viewpoint because he understood what I talked about earlier, how Christ wouldn't even lose one. He understood that concept. He couldn't get around it. In fact, in the beginning of this video, he flashes on the screen the Acts 13 passage where it says, as many Gentiles that were appointed to eternal life believed. Because he's pushing the agenda, or the truth, I should say, that there's only a limited amount of people in view here in the salvation narrative. And he knew that back then, and he fought for it. He also has videos on here about how all doesn't mean all and all this stuff. So he had the right foundational principles, but ever since he's gone astray, Derek's a sheep led astray into these myth ideas, he's getting all balled up. And he's forgetting the core things that keep this story in check. So he had that all right. All right? But somehow he's forgotten that. And he's back on this universal thing, which doesn't even make sense. But think about how good the Calvinistic viewpoint meshes with what I put forth. Because you have Israel only. Okay? Calvinism says it's only for certain people. And you have these ones being sort of chosen, right? Where Calvinism goes wrong is obviously it inserts itself into the narrative and it pushes it long beyond the end. But a form of Calvinism is properly in order to understand I.O. accurately. But let's take a listen to Derek again from a more recent. But check out his old channel. You'll find some interesting stuff on there.
Galatians also argues strongly that the uncircumcised faithful are already reckoned as Abraham's seed.
Ah, exactly. So the uncircumcised faithful are already reckoned as Abraham's seed because they are Abraham's seed. Did you ever think of that? because they are Abraham's seed. And what Paul tells them in Romans 4, he says, hey, what did our father, right? These are Gentiles, right? Now he's talking to uncircumcised ones. What did our father Abraham find according to his circumcision? In other words, what did your father Abraham find according to his circumcision? Nothing. He was justified through his faith. Therefore, it's of faith, not of the law. That's all he's saying. He's trying to win back these individuals who were not circumcised, who were Gentile in the flesh. That meaning, like the Gentiles in the flesh of their foreskin.
Which would make them descendants of the patriarchs by the work of the Spirit.
Well, we know they're descendants of the patriarchs because Paul tells the Corinthians that their fathers all passed through the Red Sea and were baptized into Moses. I mean, how much clearer can it get? Now, I know Derek would want you to believe that there's actually people that made a conscious decision for Christ and became Abraham's descendants, as opposed to them actually being Abraham's descendants and being heirs of the covenant promise and receiving that. Like Paul said, all those things happened to them as an example upon what was to come to us in the end of the age. It happened to their fathers for their purpose.
End quote. Staples' article, so I think it should be clear from those excerpts from Ehrman's blog that Jason DaCosta probably doesn't fully grasp the extent to which Dr. Staples' views actually clash with I.O.
But didn't Derek say earlier that they support I.O.? See, he's back and forth on it. Now it clashes with I.O. I never hailed any victory that it did or didn't. I was just stating some facts because Derek wanted to shine a light on this guy. But I find his theology extremely average at best. If he is able to see the eschatological nature of the New Testament and come out from that and understand that these are fulfillments, and there's a reason why only the 12 tribes are standing in heaven at the end. There's a reason why Jesus says he only comes for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Right? There's reasons for this. And I.O. does have answers for the basic objections that we get, from every Joe Schmo in Idaho. Then maybe he's got some potential to come out of it. But it's tough. It's really tough. Especially if you've been brought up on it. You want to insist that you're a Gentile. But who the hell's a Jew? Right? What is... I know James Valiant still thinks Judaism is operating at full force. But who's a Jew today without a temple? Who's a Jew today without the sacrificial system? In what capacity is any Jew today living biblically the way that the Jews did? Very, 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 very small capacity. It's just non-existent. It looks nothing like what the Bible outlines. And so to say that that system is still existing in the form that it did is nonsense. It's wackadoodle. But yet some people like Mr. Valiant claim that it is. But if I'm right and that system expired when it did, then who's a Gentile? Right? Because a Gentile would be an outsider to that specific system. It would be the nations outside. It would be those of the outside world. So who's a Gentile if that system came to its end? I'm not talking about what they've drug on and continued, but if that's all true and everything was truly taking place the way that the Bible outlines it, and there was a temple with sacrifices for the remission of sins of the people, who's doing all this? Right? Nobody. So, just something to think about.
But since he admits to having only partially reading through the blog post, let's see what Dr. Staples says in his actual 2011 article that DaCosta actually read. Staples starts by outlining four major interpretations of all Israel in Romans 11:25.
Now, I'm not going to bore you with the details of what Staples thinks the four views are or what the four conflicting views are. I think if we're all in this field, we all kind of know what those views are for the most part. But I recommend, and I posted it in the comments, if you want to read his 20-page article, you should. You should definitely. If you're IO, like I said, it has some supportive facts and information in it. So you should definitely read it. But I'm just going to skip forward here a little, see if we can get to a little more meat and potato here, because I got to wrap this thing up.
Definitions for the terms Israel, as it is used in the Hebrew Bible. The patriarch, Jacob, Israel. The nation composed of his descendants, that is, all 12 tribes of Israel, including Judah. The northern kingdom, the 10 tribes of the house of Israel, excluding the southern kingdom and the house of Judah, separate. And the returnees from Judah after the Babylonian exile. Staples claims that the evidence points to the fact that the first century Jews, Paul in particular, continued to make the distinctions the distinction of all Israel as referring to all 12 tribes as a whole.
Now that's a fact that I like, and that's one of the reasons why I said his article helps IO, because it shows that into the first century the term all Israel was used to speak of the 12 tribes, not just Judah and not just the northern kingdom, but there was an all Israel aspect. There was a unified 12 tribe aspect to that term, and a lot of those early writers and people in that time actually used that phrase. That was their expectation. So that's one of the things why I said read the article, because it talks about that, which proves why Paul does what he does in Romans 11 when he concludes with his entire goal shown in bright light, and so all Israel will be saved.
Josephus certainly upholds the distinction referring to Israelites in antiquity and in antiquities only. Capitals, only in the book Antiquities, in reference to the pre-exilic and exilic periods. According to Staples, once the northern tribes are off the scene, Josephus restricts himself to more precise terminology referring only to the southern tribes. He no longer speaks of Israel, but only the Jews. For ease of reference, here are the historical periods we're talking about. Here are some key quotations of Dr. Staples' paper, which I have broken up and redacted to present the salient points. Quote, number 1. The Qumran community was not alone in anticipating a full restoration of the northern tribes. For Ezra 13, verse 40 through 47, expects the eschatological restoration of the 10 tribes still lost in exile.
Now, keep in mind, right, you guys, if you're listening to this is some valuable insight and information and stuff that I will personally be looking more into, right? I love when facts verify what I'm believing is true, because like a lot of these things that he mentions here, these passages like, I don't know, whatever he just said, they back up IO because it shows that they expected the 10 northern tribes to be saved in this eschatological end time scenario. Right? I mean, so that just further adds to IO's case that this is the truth of what's being said in this New Testament literature.
As does Testament of Benjamin 10, which connects this restoration with the resurrection and the Lord revealing his salvation to all nations. Number 2, evidence from the early Jesus movement suggests similar expectations. Jesus' selection of the 12 and his promise that they would judge the 12 tribes clearly demonstrate anticipation of a pan-Israelite restoration, as does his promise that the Son of Man will gather the elect from the four winds.
Okay, so number 2, he's fully on board with IO. Everything he said there was perfect. You got your 12 apostles judging the 12 tribes of Israel. You got seeking the elect from the four winds of the earth. But he's not connecting the dots. He's not understanding that what's going on with the Gentiles, the nations, is that being fulfilled.
Number 3. The present consensus notwithstanding, Paul also makes it abundantly clear in Romans 9 verse 6 that when he says Israel, he does not restrict his meaning to ethnic Jews, nor does he think all who are born Jews are Israel.
Correct. Not all Israel is Israel. That's what he was saying in that time. He's saying, look, it's not, it's not as though all those of the law are Abraham's seed, but it's the children of the promise who are counted as the seed.
In addition, Paul frames his ministry in New Covenant language, suggesting the centrality of the restoration of all Israel to his gospel.
Now, Staples is kind of IO here, right? The centrality of all Israel to his gospel. He's kind of IO, but then kind of leaks and he goes further beyond the boundaries of where he can push it. All right, he's very close in that regard.
Considering the role of the New Covenant in Paul's proclamation, it is critical to remember that Jeremiah's prophecy primarily concerns the reconstitution of all Israel. That is, both Israel and Judah will be restored by means of God's writing the law on their hearts. In fact, the prophecy is part of the larger section promising the return of the northern kingdom and the reunification of all 12 tribes.
So there's Staples again, acknowledging more Old Testament documents that show that this was the expectation and the return of the northern tribes. Now tell me again why we shouldn't be considering IO seriously, folks. Why? I think a lot of people are, and I think a lot of people want to, and they know it sounds right, but they're afraid to dive in. But Staples Derek's reading Jason Staples, article here, and he's showing you that he's aware of these things. So then why not let it say what it says?
Significantly, Gentiles are not mentioned in Jeremiah's prophecy.
Correct.
The covenant will be made with only Israel and Judah. Thus, if Paul thought that the new covenant was being fulfilled, he would have been expecting the miraculous return of the northern tribes. Instead, he strangely obsesses over the mystery of the circumcision-free justification of.
Now it's interesting because he's right there. You can see him teetering, right? He's like, if this was really the end, Paul would have been looking for the restoration of the 10 tribes, right? That's what he is looking for. That's what he is looking for. And I can only imagine the thoughts that are going through Derek's head as he's reading this. He's probably thinking, holy cow, it keeps backing up IO as it goes on.
The Gentiles, while still insisting that he is preaching the fulfillment of the new covenant. It is in pondering.
Paul said the new covenant was for Jacob, right? He said the deliverer will come out of Zion, turn ungodliness away from Jacob, for this is my covenant with Jacob when I take away Jacob's sins. Well, the new covenant was made with Jacob.
This paradox, that all the pieces snap together. Paul's mystery is that faithful Gentiles, those with the law written on their hearts,
which is only Israel,
see Romans 2, verse 14 through 15, are the returning remnant of the house of Israel, united with the faithful from the house of Judah, the inward Jews of Romans 2, 28 through 29. Identifying faithful Gentiles with the returning house of Israel obviously assigns much more significance to Romans 9, 23 through 26, where after first declaring natural ancestry and an insufficient criterion for covenant membership, 9, 6 through 13, he's talking about who the promises are for and all that, but he even goes to make the point, just because you're a descendant doesn't mean you're one of them.
Correct. It still doesn't extend outside of the descendants, though. This is where they go wrong. They open that concept up. But check Paul's words out again in Romans 4. The promise was to Abraham. The promise was not to Abraham and to his seed through the law, but it was through the righteousness of faith. So it was to Abraham and to his seed through faith, not the law. It still doesn't extend beyond the seed. Right? It still doesn't extend beyond the seed. What's the passage Paul talks about when... 1 Corinthians 15, 22. Christ the first fruits, then those who are Christ at his coming, then comes the end. Christ said he wouldn't lose one. They'd all be raised up on the last day. Who is this seed? It's Israel.
All right, it's the chosen, right? And defending God's justice in election, who are you, O man, to answer back to God? Paul quotes Hosea's words to the northern kingdom, demonstrating that God is calling his elect. The house of Israel has...
Demonstrating that God is calling his elect. Okay, so then why are we opening that up to the mixed bag o' nuts? I mean, why are we making that assumption? Why not just let the New Testament fulfill some of the promises of old? See, they would say, because that's not possible. But again, they're forgetting that Jesus said he wouldn't lose one, that they would hear his voice, that he knew where his sheep were, that he would seek them all out, that the Holy Spirit would take them to them, and he wouldn't lose one.
As intermarried among the nations, no longer having the distinction of being elect. Once a part of God's elect nation, Ephraim has become not my people, indistinct from the non-chosen nations. That is, they have become Gentiles. What does not my people mean if not Gentiles?
Indistinct, he said, from the other peoples. Yet Paul said in Romans 9, if the Lord hadn't left us a seed, we would have become like Sodom and Gomorrah. How the heck does that work? When Paul is asking about the mercy that God is having upon the Gentiles or upon the individuals in the nations, he quotes, if God hadn't left us a seed, we would have become like Sodom. So how does it work if this is a mixed bag o' nuts? Because everybody would be mixed. It just never ends. There's no ending to that scenario. But yet Paul says he left a seed. So that implies very clearly that there was people out there that God already knew, that were predestined. That's what Paul says. And that were being gathered back in. They were like sheep led astray, but they were being gathered back into the shepherd of their souls. And in the end, when we see the 12 tribes flocking around in heaven, they're described as sheep following the shepherd wherever he goes.
Hosea 8, verse 8 sums up the situation. Israel, the north, is swallowed up. They are now in the nations.
Among the nations. Swallowed up among the nations. Now, but guess what? There's tons of proof in the Old Testament that Israel would be called out of those nations. So Derek's making much to do about nothing here with Hosea 8:8. The Bible shows that they would be swallowed up among the nations, but that they would be brought out of those nations. All one has to do is look at Deuteronomy, Ezekiel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Hosea, to see that they would be brought out of those nations. Isn't it funny how Derek quotes Hosea 8:8, but doesn't quote Hosea 1 and 2, which says that even though Israel's scattered far and wide, he would bring them back. The remnant would be saved. Isn't it funny how he says that it's only possible for them to be swallowed up and never to be found again? But he leaves out all the restoration promises that come right alongside of that. That's kind of suspect, if you ask me.
Gentiles, like a worthless vessel. Paul appears to be subtly echoing this passage when he defends God's choice in making some of the lump, Israel, into worthless vessels for dishonor, leading to the inclusion of the Gentiles, citing Hosea's...
No, some of the Jews, right, to the inclusion of the lost tribes.
...promise of the restoration of not my people as proof. Uncircumcised Gentiles, with the not my people being restored to Israel as promised in Hosea. So Paul takes the radical step of identifying faithful, that is to say, as promised, Ephraim's seed is being restored from among the nations.
Is anyone else confused? So we got Ephraim's seed being restored from among the nations, but it's not really Ephraim's seed. It's everybody kind of mixed together. That makes sense?
Being redeemed from its cut-off Gentile state, becoming...
Yeah, but how can it be redeemed if it's now mixed in with everybody? It can't be redeemed.
Children of the living God once again. Moreover, in the process, God has provided for the salvation of the Gentiles by scattering Ephraim among the nations, only to be restored in saving Ephraim. God saves the nations.
So God scattered Ephraim. God wanted to save Ephraim, but the only way God could save Ephraim is through the saving of the nations. Do you see the delusion? What a difficult way to do the Bible. Why not just let it say what it says? This is Ephraim coming back from the nations, plain and simple. Instead, we have to kind of dilute it and warp it so that it says something that it doesn't. So God scattered Ephraim into the nations, according to Jason Staples. And in order to save Ephraim, God had to go out and save Gentiles, because naturally Ephraim would be mixed in with all these Gentiles. So everybody who comes in today is apparently, I don't know, maybe a descendant of Ephraim, mixed in with Gentiles.
In saving the nations, God saves Ephraim.
So in saving the nations, God saves Ephraim. So what's God's objective? Is it to save Ephraim or save the nations? Doesn't make any sense. Thankfully, we have incredibly clear pictures into the throne room of heaven at the end of this whole mission, and we see that it's only Israel, and that it actually says that no one but them could learn the redemption song, because these were the ones redeemed from the earth. No one but them. Yet these guys would have you believe that everybody can come in. How does no one but and everybody work together? It doesn't.
Thus, the new covenant not only restores Israel, but also in the unforeseen plan of God, fulfills the promises to Abraham that all the nations would be blessed, not through his seed, i.e. as outsiders, but by inclusion and incorporation in his seed.
Inclusion and incorporation in his seed. So that's what it's all about, according to them. That it's about becoming a descendant of Abraham. Symbolically, of course, right? Silliness. Nonsense. Okay?
Galatians 3:8. Paul insists that these faithful Gentiles are not to become Jews, that is, Judah. In order to become members of Israel, rather, they have already become Israelites through the new covenant. Thus, all persons should remain in the state in which they were called.
Right, because imagine Paul going to Israelites who are dead in trespasses and sins, and them wanting to come back and, partake in the law again. This is what his whole point in Galatians was. Don't be, again, entangled under the law. You've been set free. He's died for you. He's nailed the handwritten requirements to the cross, blah, blah, blah. He's the end of the law to those who believe, blah, blah, blah. So anyways, look, I'm 33 minutes in. There's about 17 minutes left in Derek's presentation. I think I've said enough. I don't think it needs to be beat down any further. I think that we can all see where the inconsistencies are, where the fine-tooth comb comes out where it shouldn't, and where these guys are not just allowing the story to say what it says, just like they do with the Old Testament. In the New Testament, these guys look at historical details and information, and they say, it's possible that the northern tribes weren't even in the nations, therefore this can't be saying that. Nonsense. I choose to look at what the Old Testament says. The Old Testament doesn't have any of the concerns that Derek and Dr. Staples have about intermingling and mixing. The Old Testament actually says that Israel would be brought right back out of those nations with no concern for in what condition they were. None whatsoever. But the story wants you to just accept it for what it says and doesn't want you to fine-tooth comb it. Because then you end up kind of thinking that you're a Gentile and you're a futurist, and there's all kinds of wackadoodle stuff that comes from that. But Israel only still stands. There is no threat here. I know that, because this guy's got a doctor in front of his name, we're supposed to, get excited. We talk to a lot of people that have doctors in front of their names, and we don't get excited for very much. And this is not something that's very attractive, or, what's attractive about it, and coming across Staples, to me anyway, is that there's other facts out there that I didn't know that really solidify and back up Israel-only's case. Like the passages that Derek just quoted that are not in the Bible, but are ancient Jewish writings, and actually verify that they did expect the 10 northern tribes to be saved from the nations. Right? That's fascinating stuff. That goes along perfectly with what I say the New Testament is. Or like the term all Israel. Now, I knew that contemporaries like Josephus and Paul and everybody, they used that term all Israel. I knew that the term all Israel and Jacob and everything was used of the 12 tribes as a whole in the Old Testament. That's very evident. But it's nice to hear from a scholar who's done probably more research on the topic than I have, that was in fact terminology that was used to describe all 12 tribes. And he, just like I do, believes that that's why Paul uses it in Romans 11. And so all Israel will be saved. All 12 tribes in the end. That was the hopeful expectation. And so I'll leave it at that. I can't imagine me coming back to Staples' articles. Maybe if he gets him on the show and he addresses some of the things with I.O., maybe I'll take a look at it. I know that he's got Richard Carrier looking at some stuff as well, and I hope to take a look at that as well. But again, it's all about time. It's all about separation. If you guys catch my drift on that, if you follow me for a while, you know what I mean. I need the time to separate, get myself to a place of peace and be able to look at things. Otherwise, I'm just driving the point home in my truck, doing little tidbits, little quips, short quips, hitting you, So we'll see what time permits, but I just wanted to give this a quick response, and I hope you all enjoyed it. If you did, give it a like, and have a great day. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.